Welcome to Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy, brought to you by the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. And now, here's your host, Michael Morris.
Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University, in collaboration with leading economic and social policy researchers at Rutgers and Harvard, welcomes you to our podcast series, Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy. Today, I'm so pleased to be joined by two individuals, Yana Rodgers and Jennifer Cohen. Both are university professors. Both are economists by background. Both have done a great deal of work on women's health and economic issues. I do want to have us perhaps, before we start in on the topic of the day, which is long COVID, to ask each of you, because this is a podcast series on Let's Get to Work, tell us a little bit about your career path and what really focused you on becoming researchers on economic issues and particularly on minority populations. I'll start with you, Yana. Maybe you can amplify a little bit about your background, but maybe there's some interesting insights on how you got to be where you are today.
What a great question, Mike. Thank you. I started off with an interest in business, which, thanks to the guidance of an advisor in undergraduate, turned to graduate school in economics, where I wanted to study development economics in particular. And a large part of my body of work still is in development economics. But within that work, I was looking a lot at gender differences, and that has progressed to taking a keen interest in other groups that have been marginalized in the workforce, including sexual and gender minorities and people with disabilities. And that more recent work, as well as research with Jen, looking at COVID and how women in particular have experienced COVID, led us to look at long COVID and some of the limitations that people are experiencing at work because of their symptoms and impairments that are due to long COVID.
Thank you, Yana. And Jennifer, how about you? How did you get to where you are today and focus on the interests that you have?
So I started in geography and sociology in undergrad, and then I moved into political science, and then I moved into economics. And the whole time, what was kind of guiding all of those shifts between fields was an interest in inequality. And so as that became increasingly clear, initially I was looking at gender, and then I was looking between countries and international relations. And then I decided to do the PhD in economics and really pursue looking at inequality and inequity across different groups. And so from there, I started doing research in South Africa, one of the least equal countries in the world, of course. And I started doing work with nurses, Black women nurses in a public hospital there. And so that's where I really started getting into the health research and looking at these facets of inequity among healthcare workers in particular, but really in the entire health system. I also had an interest in economic development, and that was a bit of where I started. I was thinking about constraints on development, microeconomic and macroeconomic constraints on development. And of course, the labor supply is a critical one. So if we're looking at women in healthcare, the entire economy really is dependent on women's well-being and healthcare for the economy itself to flourish. So that thread of inequality really pulled my work together over time.
Okay, just nice to have that kind of background and perspective. But let's jump into the topic of the day, long COVID. You're both co-authors of a new journal article that is focused on understanding and creating new knowledge about long COVID. Yana, maybe I'll start with you. Can you share with our audience, what questions were you seeking to answer?
Of course. So as I mentioned in my introduction, Jen and I, we met actually during the pandemic online, and we started writing about the pandemic, several articles in which we were exploring especially the extent to which healthcare workers and women were being impacted by the pandemic. And this got us to look at a lot of the data on the pandemic in the US. And we started reading more about people who were calling themselves long haulers, who were affected by lasting symptoms or new symptoms after having gotten COVID, now being referred to as long COVID. So these are symptoms lasting at least 4 weeks after first being infected, and they can be new symptoms or ongoing symptoms and health problems. And we were quite struck by, in our initial look at the data, an uneven distribution of who is reporting these symptoms. And we hadn't seen much work into looking at why these disparate impacts, but very sometimes, debilitating symptoms, brain fog, fatigue, depression, exhaustion, a long list of symptoms that can really affect one's ability to participate in the labor market and to work to one's full potential. So that's what motivated our article, was to look at why these different distributions of who is being affected by long COVID, and then what can be done about that.
And just to follow up, I know it would be helpful to understand what were your data sources. You're both quantitative researchers, so what was your field of analysis?
So we used two data sets in this particular paper, this study. One was the Household Pulse Survey, which I will defer to Jen to talk a little bit more about. And then the other one is the Current Population Survey, which we used mostly to look at who is working remotely during the pandemic. But the first part of the study did use the Household Pulse Survey, and I'll jump to Jen to have her tell you a little more about that data.
Thank you, Yana. Yeah, the Household Pulse Survey is a biweekly survey that the Census Bureau put out to inform policy responses to issues that were happening at the time or are happening at the time. And so they added questions in 2022 about long COVID, then later on about activity limitation. So that was kind of the basic descriptive data that we used to find out about what was going on. This is nationally representative data for the US. So that was the basic data set that showed us what the prevalence was. Right. And so there was where we found, when we looked at prevalence, that it was about 31% of people who'd had COVID ended up developing long COVID.
That sort of takes us to trying to understand what I think your research broke new ground, and that is not looking at just one overall group of people, but looking at demographic differences. Let me go back to Yana, perhaps, if you can take this one, and that is, who did you learn was most likely to develop long COVID?
Well, the numbers really jumped off the page in a striking, stunning, and disturbing way, where we saw that transgender folks and people with pre-existing disabilities are much more likely than the general population and than any other demographic group to report that they've developed long COVID. Just over half of all people with a pre-existing disability developed long COVID if they already had COVID, and almost half, 48%, of transgender folks. And again, that is, substantially more than the average, which Jen mentioned. 31% of adults who had COVID went on to develop long COVID. We also found that women more than men developed long COVID, as well as Hispanic people more than non-Hispanic people, and people with less than a college degree were also substantially more likely to develop long COVID. We also looked at both sexual orientation together with transgender status and called that category sexual and gender minorities. And we found that compared to straight and cisgender people, sexual and gender minorities were also substantially more likely to develop long COVID.
And if I turn now back to Jen, is there also, I believe in what you studied, a demographic difference in the impact of long COVID on activity limitations? And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the distribution with activity limitations really echoed the distribution that we saw with prevalence. So, the activity limitations were, again, the most common among people with pre-existing disability, and then were more concentrated among women and among people with less than a college education than among, for example, men and people with college educations. And the activity limitations were really left pretty wide open in the question in the household pulse survey. It was really just do you experience limitations on your day-to-day activities without specifying what those were, which leaves open a possibility that we have some undercounting about what people consider day-to-day activities also. So the limitations data may understate the degree of limitations people actually are experiencing.
And Yana, anything you'd like to add about that?
No, one more thing to add, we also looked at severe activity limitations and the same kind of findings, the same demographic groups. The one demographic group that was a bit more nuanced, we found, and we're using the term Hispanic because that's the category name used in the household pulse survey. So for Hispanic individuals, we did find a substantially higher prevalence compared to non-Hispanic people for long COVID, but that differential virtually disappeared when we looked at activity limitations. And, I think that echoes some findings in the literature that others have found that Hispanic folks may be more likely to get COVID, but then work through it because, don't have the room or the luxury to be able to, say, stay home from work. So some of that may be going on in who reports activity limitations. We found that differential disappeared for for Hispanic versus non-Hispanic.
Let me go to what, from a public policy standpoint, was a defining moment when the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, did come out with guidance that long COVID does qualify as a disability under the ADA and as well as under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. What this does is allow for eligibility for reasonable accommodation upon request. I guess my question is that many people with long COVID may be hesitant to admit their disability or may not even know that they're protected by these civil rights laws. Maybe I'll go back to Jen. What do you think employers can do to address this challenge? And is there a role for public policy changes?
That's an excellent question. There's definitely a role for public policy changes. There's no question about that. Employers, of course, have lots of options when it comes to providing accommodations. One of them that we wrote about was working from home, but there are a wide range of accommodations that can be made, including flexibility at work, flexibility with hours. So there are many angles for employers to take that could provide the kinds of the kinds of accommodations that people need to deal with things like having brain fog, where working consistently may pose a set of challenges. People may need to take breaks and things like that.
Let me pose the same question to Yana, if you might have some additional thoughts.
Yeah, so we did write about remote work, and that, of course, was quite common during the pandemic, and was being granted to a lot of people who do not report disabilities. In fact, we found in the CPS data, Michael, you asked about the CPS data earlier, or are there sources? When we did a full set of econometric regressions, we were finding that people without disabilities were actually more likely to be doing pandemic-related remote work compared to people without disabilities. But once we controlled for or added in some controls for occupation and industry, as well as demographic characteristics, that seemed to explain a lot of who was able to work remotely. And Jen actually coined a term for this, which I will let her talk about in just a moment. But we interpreted that as once, we allow these other characteristics of workers to kind of soak up this effect of who's working remotely, then we found that a certain kind of people with disabilities, those were people with cognitive disabilities and people with mobility impairments, they were indeed more likely to do pandemic-related remote work. So, and people with cognitive disabilities, of course, that category in the CPS mirrors most closely the brain fog and the other mental exhaustion that's happening with symptoms of long COVID. We couldn't measure long COVID exactly with the CPS. So the closest we could come was people who reported cognitive disabilities. So back to your question, Michael, of policy. This really speaks to the importance of employment policy by employers to allow more remote work as an accommodation for people with disabilities, and to consider, what can be done in terms of government policy, but especially employer policies around remote work is imperative. And I'm going to go back to Jen to talk a bit more about this finding about remote work and the phrase that she came up with.
Thank you, Yana. Yeah, so we were looking at this question about what employers were doing in terms of policy and what employers may have been, forced into doing, not having a choice about. And so one of the things I was thinking about at the time was the debate that was going on about the labor shortage, quote unquote, labor shortage, and resistance to returning to the office. And I was thinking about sources of resistance to returning to an office among friends of mine and colleagues of mine and other people that I was seeing on social media, especially during the pandemic, particularly among people who are neurodiverse. There was a real resistance to going back to the office. And one of the reasons really seemed to be that there was a perceived lost productivity that might happen going back to the office and being surrounded by distractions that people had managed to be away from when they were able to work from home. Of course, which people were able to work from home is a certain set of workers, which is why the occupational segregation material is so relevant. But in terms of this idea of having some unintentional accommodation, the idea there really is that there's a vast, vast pool of people. If you look at the high school data, I think this was from 2016, the high school data showed that 40% of people in high school had a disability at some point. Of that group, 60% went to colleges, 2 years or 4-year colleges. And then out of those, only 13% told the school that they had a disability and then were, pursuing accommodation for it. And then if you look at the labor force statistics, of course, the number's even smaller. I think there was an average of 3% of employees that disclosed that they had a disability, which means that there's a huge number of employed people with disabilities, especially cognitive or diverse kinds of people that have disabilities that are not being accommodated. Many people probably wouldn't even entertain the possibility of asking for an accommodation, but who found themselves during the pandemic with the accommodation of working from home, and then would be extremely hesitant and resistant to give that up if they found a way that worked better for them.
And in addition to challenges that are explained by occupation and industries where someone works, what did you also find about gender and education? Let me go back to you, Yana.
Yes, again, what we found was that women and people with less education were more likely to get long COVID. One thing that our mutual colleague, Doug Cruz, suggested we look at was the occupation and industry distribution. And what we were finding is substantial differences, between men and women within industries in who is getting COVID, which suggests that even within industry categories, men and women are in different occupations, and women are more likely in front-facing occupations in which they are being exposed to people who have COVID, are more likely to get COVID, and then develop long COVID. And some of that is not only happening in the workforce, it's also happening at home, because women are the primary caregivers. And when kids come home sick, having caught COVID at school or wherever from their friends, who's spending more time with them on average, it's women. And that could contribute also to the greater likelihood of women developing long COVID.
Well, and now in 2023, the pendulum has kind of shifted in terms of, I do love your phrasing, unintentional accommodation related to working remotely. This probably is not going to have a good impact on people with disabilities, and more specifically, people with long COVID. Maybe I'll start with Jen, but really love to get both of your opinions. What could be done to promote greater acceptance of workplace flexibilities, including remote work?
In terms of really promoting flexibility, I think the biggest thing that needs to happen is a real massive recognition that disability is so widespread. And that really is something that needs to happen at all levels. You mentioned employers not knowing that people had disabilities, but there are people that don't know that they have disabilities by ADA definitions also, and especially with long COVID, I think that that's going to be a really significant shift, that cognitive disabilities become very widespread, and that acknowledgement and then a demand for accommodation is the best way that we're going to get to see some actual change. It is, of course, important for employers to be aware that this shift has happened, especially when the employers don't match the demographics who have been most susceptible. So if we have people in management who have college educations and are not, front-facing office workers, and then we have women of color, for example, who are working in front offices or doing like accommodation kind of work, in particular, they're thinking of accommodation and food services as one of the industries, then you have these very different demographic groups making policies for some workers that have been affected in really disproportionate ways.
That doesn't relate just to long COVID, but in general, in terms of who's making the policies versus their demographic makeup. So point well taken. I don't know, Yana, you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah. There's always, there's often, not always, often a silver lining to events, negative events, and it could be the silver lining of COVID-19 is that it is, as you say in our paper, a mass disabling event in which more people, are potentially sensitized to the needs of people with disabilities. And so many people do have undisclosed disabilities. So long COVID could tip the scale in sensitizing more people, coworkers, as well as employers, to the needs of people with disabilities for accommodations. But what really needs to happen is an end to the stigma around disability and the stigma of asking for disabilities or asking for accommodations. I was just in an informal discussion last week after we had a panel looking at Disability Awareness Month, and we were talking informally about the stigma and whether somebody, who wants to ask for an accommodation or is thinking about it, whether to disclose in the workplace if they have a disability. And the conclusion was, unfortunately, still largely no, don't disclose unless you have to, because of the stigma around disability and requesting accommodations. And here we are at the end of 2023, and we're still answering this question, should I disclose? With the answer of, well, no, if you don't have to, don't disclose. And I really hope that that will change. But that was an eye-opening conversation that we had last week.
Yeah, excellent insight. Thank you. I was quite taken in your journal article to come out soon. You move beyond reasonable accommodations in terms of remote work to a long list of other options that should be considered by employers. Let me start with you, Jennifer, whether you can share that with our listeners, because I thought it really broadened the concept of what could be reasonable accommodations.
Yeah, so you can think of them, in different kinds of buckets, so forth. So I do think remote work is one of the main accommodations for people with long COVID, but not the only one. And one of these other buckets, Jen made reference to earlier, and they're around flexibility. So shorter work days, flexible scheduling, reduced workloads, less contact with customers or clients, and allowing people to defer more complex job responsibilities to a later time, or maybe swapping tasks between coworkers, or sharing responsibility for some tasks, as well as taking more rest breaks. Another bucket, so to speak, is changes to the physical workspace, like more ergonomic tools or different kinds of lighting. And I think the final bucket around accommodations for people with long COVID is among their supervisors. Supervisors do need to be more knowledgeable as well as compassionate about long COVID. And one example of, an additional policy they could pass would be to have more COVID-sensitive absence policies. So supervisors really do need to be more understanding. So that's how I would best answer your question, Michael.
Okay, thank you. And it sort of kind of runs right into, if we could make, from a public policy standpoint, broaden what might be public policy to support people with long COVID continuing to work. What would that framework look like? And let me start with you, Yana, and then see if Jennifer has some additional thoughts.
Yeah. Well, something that Jen and I have been, and our colleagues in feminist economics have been arguing for decades now, is paid parental leave, paid family leave, as well as paid sick leave. The U.S. is so far behind many other countries, including many lower income countries, in not having these laws on the books. So I would advocate in terms of public policy at the national level, we desperately need paid family leave as well as paid sick leave. Many states are passing these policies, including the state where I am, New Jersey. but many still don't have it, leaving lots of folks behind if they're in states that don't have these policies.
Thank you. Jennifer, anything you'd like to add?
The only thing I would add is that there's the idea that there might be this unintentional accommodation. The major beneficiaries of that are going to be people who can work from home. And with occupational segregation, like we talked about, that's not going to affect some of the people who have been disproportionately impacted by long COVID. And that's why the buckets that Yana mentioned, that's why there's so many alternative accommodations that we list out there, because we know that work from home isn't going to be one of the ones that's going to be accessible to a lot of people in a lot of occupations. And so I would just add that public policy needs to support that whole range of accommodations that could be made within all kinds of different employment, and setting out some guidance by sector, I think, would be a useful piece of setting that up.
Okay, very helpful. If you were to think about what would be kind of your next generation of research that would follow this particular study that you did, an obvious one to me is updating it to picking up more of the data from 2023, 2024, as kind of looking out and seeing if some of the trends you identified hold up, or there variances. But if you were to collaborate again on this topic, what might be a framework for looking ahead? And I'll go to Jennifer first.
Well, we started another paper building on this one that works with intersectionality as the lens. So looking at intersections of different forms of social difference and how those come together to affect these groups in terms of demographic characteristics and occupational concentration, but also just from a public health perspective, like, what are these distributions and how do they look, and how can we explain that? Because there's a lot of information, there's a lot of data out there, but there's not a lot of explanation for why this is so concentrated among certain populations, especially when it comes to long COVID.
And Yana, anything you might add?
Of course. Another project that we're working on together is collecting qualitative information. Jen and I and two others are in the midst of conducting a bunch of interviews with healthcare workers in Indiana, and we're asking them about their experiences with their employer providing accommodations, their experiences with asking for accommodations and disclosing, and how their coworkers are treating them. So that goes beyond long COVID, but we are very much interested in this issue of stigma around disclosing, and when people ask for accommodations, how they do it, why, and then what is the response, not only from their employers, but also the responses from their coworkers.
Thank you. Do we know, or is this something obviously would have to be studied further and longitudinally? What's the economic impact of long COVID? And I just would love to get your thoughts about that, Jennifer, to start.
The economic impacts are absolutely massive in terms of dollar terms, where we actually have those things quantified already. But the real impacts on the economy extend so far beyond what we think about as production and what we measure in money terms. The impact that are happening in the reproductive economy among women and with childcare, and the impacts on our students that we're going to see for many years to come are absolutely enormous. They're far beyond any kind of dollar value that we're quantifying and measuring at now.
And Yana, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. So Jen mentioned there are some numbers. Those numbers we do have in our paper. Something like $1 trillion has been lost only due to earnings, people's reduced ability to earn. And then there was another estimate of about $2 trillion in reduced quality of life. So those are massive amounts. But as Jen is so right to say that, the impacts go beyond what we can measure in the market. And we also need to look at the reproductive sphere.
Thank you. And maybe to finish up, and I'll start with you, Yana, this time. What's the takeaway from this? Isn't an article just to be read by other researchers and academicians. What's the takeaway really from three perspectives: employers, policymakers, and individuals experiencing long COVID?
I think the takeaway from our article is that we really have to go beyond the aggregate numbers and look at distributions, who is being impacted and why. And the why has to do with the social determinants of health, which includes where people work for money and who does what at home. So policy around COVID, can't focus only on the medical. We have to look at these broader, we'll call them social determinants of health. And these are things that need to be fixed by national policy, by state government policies, as well as employer policies, including policies on accommodations. So I'll stop with that and turn to Jen.
Yeah, I would just add that one of the takeaways is the scale of disability. I mean, the scale of this is so far beyond, what people knew to begin with prior to COVID, and now, it seems so apparent that this is just a fundamental, basic part of life and of work and of the future of the country. And it really needs to be integrated into every workplace policy, every public policy, in the same way that public health should be a concern that crosses all of these areas. Disability is one of these also, and there can be no question about that now in the aftermath of COVID.
Oh, thank you both. We've covered a lot of ground, deep into a topic that is bigger than the numbers. I think you both have articulated over and over again policy implications that really change our view around some fundamental issues impacting people with disabilities, and hopefully for the listeners ahead to both learn and be impacted by what you've shared. So thank you both so much for sharing your time today.
Thank you, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy, brought to you by the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.